This was made to shield man from the lance, the sword, and the arrow. This mask shields him from flying bits of white-hot metal and blinding light. This will shield from rain, and this refuge will shield him from nature at her worst. For man at his worst, if the worst should come to pass, this shield is the shield against the worst of all possible disasters. My name is Dave Garraway, and during these next few minutes, we're going to look at one aspect of civil defense in the nuclear age in which we live. And that is where we do live, of course, at the present, in the shadow of a precarious balance of terror and a danger, small perhaps, but real, that nuclear war might happen. Defense Secretary McNamara has said that as long as a potential enemy possesses a nuclear arsenal, we must possess a nuclear deterrent. We must keep our defense strong. And that, of course, includes civil defense. Here is the Secretary of Defense, Robert S. McNamara.
In a nuclear attack, several million Americans, perhaps several tens of millions, might be killed. No program of civil defense could save all of these people, at least no program that is financially acceptable. But a comparatively modest civil defense program can provide a great deal of protection for people who are not close to points of detonation.
In January 1964, in testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the Secretary said this about the importance of civil defense as a part of total defense. Quote, "The effectiveness of an active ballistic missile defense system in saving lives depends in large part upon the existence of an adequate civil defense system. Indeed, in the absence of adequate fallout shelters, an active defense might not significantly increase the proportion of the population surviving an all-out nuclear attack. Offensive missiles could easily be targeted at the points outside the defended area and thereby achieve, by fallout, what otherwise would have been achieved by blast and heat effects. For this reason, the very austere civil defense program recommended by the President should be given priority over procurement and deployment of any major additions to the active defenses." Unquote. Secretary McNamara once called civil defense the shield in relation to the sword of military defense. In fact, the idea of the shield is what we began with, remember? The most widespread danger after the initial devastating blast and heat of the bomb is the radiation from the spreading fallout particles. And only shelter is the shield which acts against this lethal radiation effectively. We know the effects of heavy radiation all too well. And to those pundits who claim to prefer a quick, dignified death to the shielding protection of a shelter or the hardships of a post-attack world, there's one fact I think that should be made clear. There's no guarantee of a dignified and quick death. When radiation occurs, sickness is much more likely. It can be ugly, slow, agonizing, horrible, even ending in death, of course. And it's not a disease. The result of the destruction of living cells by deadly gamma radiation is a fact. And therefore, radiation is not contagious, nor what comes from it. The human body can and does repair as much of the damage as it can, and quite a bit. But the effects are there, and they add up, depending on the dose, and it's a pretty ugly thing. Would anybody really choose this if they could avoid it? And of course, much of it can be avoided. Keeping the radiation dose low depends on three things, primarily: shielding, distance, and time. Just as this bright, visible light here can penetrate a piece of transparent tinted plastic like that, so can invisible gamma radiation coming from fallout particles penetrate solid things. But just as more thicknesses of this same tinted plastic will cut down the amount of light that can reach your eyes, so will a mass of any solid material between you and the radiation source cut down the amount of gamma radiation reaching your body. This thickness now can be in the form of almost anything. Wood, could be bricks or steel or sand or concrete blocks like this. How effective a shield is in cutting down the radiation, well, that's important. And it's described by a number called the protection factor. That number tells us by how much the radiation penetrating the shield around you is reduced. For instance, take an ordinary concrete building block like this one. If you're completely surrounded by a single layer of these, the amount of radiation inside your shield is 1/10 of what it is outside, or a protection factor of 10. Now, if you add a second layer, the protection factor is increased to 100. This is all around you, mind you. So much for the shielding, for the moment. The next factor in reducing the dose is distance. Let's go back to this bulb for a moment here. This is the photographer's light meter I have here, which measures the amount of light which strikes it. And you can see on the insert there. Now, the farther away we are from the bulb, the less light strikes the meter. See it go down? And it's that way with fallout radiation. The farther away you are from the particles, the less radiation strikes you. The overall protection factor of a sheltered airport takes both the shielding and the distance into account. And then there's time, too. Most of the radioactive elements in early fallout particles decay very fast and stop being radiative. Generally speaking, if we were to measure the radiation in early fallout particles 1 hour after an explosion, and then check again after 7 hours after the explosion, we'd find that 90% of that radiation was already lost through decay. In 2 days, about 99% is gone, and so on down. Whether what's left would be dangerous or not depends on the original intensity of the fallout and whether or not there have been additional fallout since then. So you have 3 elements: time, and distance, and shielding, essential to the design of a good shelter. Most shelter space can be found in ordinary buildings, the kind you work or live in. This is a kind of typical 10-story office building. It's cut away so you can see the inside of it. Now, the fallout particles, which of course have weight and substance, would land on flat, horizontal surfaces. On, for example, the roofs of buildings, on the terrace of a building, or on the street down here. Therefore, that's where the radiation would come from. A lot of shielding built in to begin with in a building like this. The outside walls themselves have thickness. The roof has. And the earth under the street down here has. As a matter of fact, in a building like this, the inner rooms or corridors right around in here are really pretty fair fallout shelters. You see, they're far from the particles which come from here, or from here, or from here, the street up. And they have a lot of shielding built in. And incidentally, with good construction, they give a certain amount of very real protection from blast and heat as well. The fallout protection factor up here would be very much less. There's less shielding, you see, between a man in this room and the roof up here. And also, he's closer to the particles. And that's true of this terrace, which has particles on. The areas adjacent to it in here are not very good because they're close to the terrace, and they get, therefore, more radiation. The basement down here, that has fairly high protection factor, like the inner rooms we mentioned up here. And that's true of the inside rooms and corridors of many schools and factories, too. So, surprisingly enough, you can see that a great deal of fallout shelter space did exist before we knew anything about it. The government, however, needed to know all about it. Finding these spaces, therefore, became the job of the National Shelter Survey. And starting in the fall of 1961, the Defense Department contracted a specially trained task force of 1,500 architects and engineers all over the U.S., charged them with identifying potential shelter space in existing buildings and mines and caves and tunnels and, well, wherever space for 50 or more people could be found, which would meet Department of Defense specifications. These spaces were to be the backbone of our National Community Shelter Program. Now, that survey has been completed, and the spaces are now being stocked with the minimum needs for survival. The stocking of a fallout shelter means putting enough food and water and sanitary supplies and medical self-help items to allow the occupants to stay there from a day to 2 weeks or so, or for as long as it takes for the fallout to decay to safe levels. Minimal survival needs will be supplied by the federal government to all community fallout shelters, and also included are radiological detection instruments to keep track of the radiation outside. And with millions of shelter spaces to be stocked, it's no small effort. Even before the shelter survey was completed, production of these supplies had begun. More than 2,700 manufacturers and suppliers are involved, and the whole vast distribution network of the Defense Department, too. And the cost, thanks to mass production, comes to less than $2.50 per shelter space. After these supplies are delivered to one of the 81 federal distribution centers at key points all around the country, it's up to local civil defense to do the rest. The supplies and equipment are furnished free, but somebody's got to come and get them, find the trucks and the volunteer manpower needed to move the supplies into the shelters. And there's another responsibility that has to be borne at local level. Mind you, since these will be community shelters, it therefore is the community itself which must improve them and organize them and staff them and run them. The goal of the National Fallout Shelter Program is 240 million spaces. That's enough for every person in our country, at work and at home. Now, how shall we achieve this? Well, first of all, many more community shelters will be developed by improving existing spaces and ventilation, or by simple construction, which will increase the protection offered. The Office of Civil Defense has been giving technical advice and training on a rather massive scale. And private initiative will contribute still more through civil defense plans and industry, which of course will be sponsored by the industry leadership. By businesses and corporations, that is, who want to protect their own employees. And by individuals who plan to construct family shelter for personal reasons. Or through the efforts of people in rural areas who really cannot, for practical reasons, expect to be part of a community shelter program because they're not near a community. The backbone, though, of the federal civil defense plans is and will continue to be the fallout shelter. But energy and practical application to make these plans work must come from people and from communities. The federal government will help. It will train teachers, supply plans and literature and manuals. It will organize the necessary national systems. But the community, and that's the people in it, must help themselves, first by knowing about and then by supporting the incorporation of shelter space in new construction, whenever that can be accomplished. And by joining their civil defense organization in setting up a sound system of their own with the proper physical space, the proper communications, and the proper leadership to handle any and all disaster situations. This program is one of a series designed to acquaint you with the facts about fallout shelters and civil defense. It's up to you to know what this sign means, and where your nearest community shelter is, and what's in it, and what you should do in case of attack, and what you can do right now. We spoke of man's desire through known history to shield himself from danger. And this is modern man's best shield against the greatest danger of them all.